The saddle looked worthless, cracked leather, frayed stitching, sun-baked near to ruin. Jed Calhoun only had $3 to his name, and it seemed a fair trade for a drifter who'd lost nearly everything. But when he turned it over, the dust revealed a name carved faint into the flap: Jesse James. In that instant, Jed's life changed forever. Because legends don't vanish, they wait to be found. And whoever knew this saddle was missing would kill to get it back. Jed hadn't bought a saddle. He'd bought a death sentence. The summer sun beat down on the dusty main street of Red Bluff, its heat clinging to every weathered board, every squeaking hitching post, every man who moved slow enough to feel it. On days like this, folks didn't linger outside unless they had business worth the sweat. Jed Calhoun figured he had just enough coin in his pocket to make his trip into town worth the bother. $3, that was all. Not enough for a horse, not enough for a rifle, not enough for whiskey, enough to forget the last year of his life. But maybe enough for a saddle. His old one had given out. Cracked leather, torn rigging, stitching frayed to nothing. A cowboy without a saddle wasn't much more than a man wandering dirt roads with boots full of holes. The Red Bluff mercantile kept its cast-offs out front, lined along the porch rail like old soldiers too busted to march. Jed ran a hand over the leather of the first one, the sun having baked it stiff as a coffin lid, not worth a dime. The next sagged under its own weight, stuffing showing where the seat had torn open. The third, Jed paused. The saddle was battered, worn near to ruin, the leather pitted by years of hard rides. But there was something in the tooling along the skirt, something half-hidden under the dust. A hand-carved design, curling vines and stars pressed deep, the kind of work a craftsman did slow and proud. Even ragged, it had a feel of history. Jed squinted at the tag. $3. He spat into the dust, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and nodded to himself. "Well, old fella," he murmured to the saddle, "you and me'll make do." Inside the mercantile, he dropped his coins on the counter. The storekeep barely glanced at the saddle before shrugging and sweeping the coins away. "Don't know why you'd waste money on that wreck," the man muttered. "Don't know why you'd sell it if it weren't worth keeping," Jed shot back, lifting the saddle to his shoulder. The weight surprised him, heavier than it looked, solid under the scuffs. He hauled it outside, set it across the rail, and started picking at the layers of dirt. That was when he saw it. On the underside of the flap, worn faint but still legible, a name had been pressed into the leather with a steady hand. Jesse James. Jed froze, breath locking in his chest. He'd heard the name since boyhood, every saloon, every campfire. Jesse James, the outlaw who robbed trains and banks, who vanished into history with more rumors than facts to his name. Dead, they said. Or hiding. Or both, depending on who told the tale. Jed's hand shook as he traced the letters. The dog barking down the street, the clatter of a wagon, the mutter of townsfolk. All of it faded. He was holding a piece of legend bought for $3 and dust. But as he stared at the saddle, one thought cut through the awe and the heat, and the pounding of his heart. If this saddle had belonged to Jesse James, then somebody out there knew it had gone missing, and they might be willing to kill to get it back. Jed kept his hand over the tooled name, as if the sun might burn the letters away if he let go. The saddle felt heavier now, like it carried not just leather and wood, but every whispered story told about the man who'd once ridden it. He looked up and scanned the street. No one seemed to be paying him mind. 2 women loading flour into a wagon, a blacksmith leaning against his door wiping soot off his forearms, a drunk staggering out of the saloon. Still, Jed felt the prickle of eyes that weren't supposed to be there. He hoisted the saddle back onto his shoulder and started for the livery. His bay gelding, Red, whickered from the stall as soon as Jed stepped in. The horse nosed the saddle with interest, ears flicking forward like it could smell something different about this relic. "Yeah, boy," Jed murmured, throwing the old rig across Red's back. "You ever figure you'd be wearing history?" The leather creaked, stiff but strong enough to hold. Jed tightened the cinch, running his fingers over the horn, scarred from ropes and time. He swung into the seat, and though it was worn near flat, it fit him better than his old one ever had, almost like it had been waiting. The liveryman stuck his head out from the tack room. His brows drew down when he saw the saddle. "Where'd you get that?" "Mercantile," Jed answered, tugging the reins. $3. The man's face went pale under the streaks of dirt. He stepped out slow, wiping his hands on his apron. "You ride that through town, son. You best be careful whose shadow you wake." Jed's stomach tightened. "You know it?" The liveryman spat into the straw. "Knew a fella years back rode with the James boys. Swore Jesse's saddle had a mark of stars and vines on the skirts just like that. Said he carried it through Missouri clear into Dakota. Some say he died with it. Some say it was lost in a bank job gone sour." Jed rubbed a thumb over the tooling. His pulse drummed in his ears. "And now it's sittin' in Red Bluff sold like scrap." "Nothing stays buried out here," the liveryman said grimly. "Question is, who put it up for sale, and who's going to come looking when they realize it's gone?" Jed rode out of the livery with dust curling up under Red's hooves, the saddle creaking like it wanted to tell him stories it had held too long. He kept his hat brim low, but it didn't matter. Word traveled faster than a bullet in Red Bluff. By the time he reached the edge of town, he could feel it spreading behind him. Murmurs rising, men leaning close, women whispering his name with the outlaws. He headed for the open country, where the hills rose sharp and the sage carried its dry perfume. But no matter how far he rode, the name followed him, stamped into the leather under his legs. Jesse James, and Jed Calhoun knew. His life wasn't his own anymore, because a man doesn't pay $3 for a saddle like that. He pays with everything he's got left. Jed Calhoun rode hard out of Red Bluff, the sun baking the crown of his hat and the wind pushing dry sage dust into his teeth. The saddle creaked under him, stiff but sure, like it was settling into his weight. It carried him different, higher, prouder, like he belonged in it, but every creak reminded him of the name burned faint into the flap. Jesse James. The outlaw most men whispered about in saloons after 2 whiskeys, when courage was cheap. The man who could rob a train at dusk and vanish into prairie shadows before dawn. The man whose death had been reported a dozen times in a dozen counties, none of them certain. Some swore he was buried in Missouri. Others said he was living under another name in Texas. Jed had never believed half the stories, until now. The saddle was real, which meant some of the stories might be too. Jed pulled up on the reins at the rise above Dry Creek Gulch. Red snorted, eager to keep running, but Jed swung down and let him graze. He set a boot on a rock and stared out across the land. Empty hills, cottonwoods lining the creek bed, buzzards making lazy circles overhead. But Jed didn't feel alone. He drew a long breath, trying to shake the feeling that eyes were stitched into the air around him. The liveryman's words stuck like burrs. Who put it up for sale, and who's going to come looking when they realize it's gone? Jed knelt by the saddle, ran his hand over the horn. His fingers brushed against a seam, rougher than the rest. He tugged. The stitching was old, but deliberate. Jed worked his knife along the seam until the leather peeled back just enough to show a hollow space beneath. Something rattled. Jed's breath caught as he reached inside. His fingers closed on a small metal cylinder, no longer than a man's thumb. He pulled it free, wiped it clean. A cartridge. But not just any round. Scratched into its brass casing were words so small he had to hold it up to the sun. Liberty Bank, Clay County. Jed's blood ran cold. He knew that name. Everyone did. The James gang's most infamous raid. The one where men had died, where the whole state of Missouri had nearly raised arms to hunt them down. This saddle had carried Jesse James through that fire. And here was a cartridge marked with the bank's name, hidden for decades in its folds like a relic of sin. Jed slid it back into the hollow and pressed the leather flat. He tied it tight, his pulse hammering. If this cartridge meant what he thought, then the saddle wasn't just history, it was evidence. Proof of what had really happened that day. Maybe even proof Jesse hadn't died when they said. And if Jed could find that proof, others would kill to silence it. He rode back toward his lined shack in the foothills before dusk, keeping to dry washes and deer trails. He didn't want to be seen until he knew what he was carrying. When he topped the last ridge, the shack came into view, a lean-to of timbers, a stone chimney, smoke curling thin into the sky from the fire he'd left banked that morning. But the smoke was too thick. Jed's gut twisted. He spurred Red hard, the gelding leaping the last rise. The shack was burning. Flames licked at the roof, logs cracking and groaning as they gave way. The corral gate hung open, and his 2 pack mules were gone. Jed yanked Red to a halt. The gelding reared, eyes rolling, ears laid back at the heat. Jed held the reins tight, teeth clenched as he scanned the ground. Boot tracks, fresh, too many to count. Somebody had come looking already. Jed turned Red away from the blaze and kicked hard, driving for the hills before the firelight could paint him against the skyline. He rode until the stars pricked open across the dark, until Red's flanks were wet with sweat. Only then did he slow, pulling up in a stand of cottonwoods. He swung down, trembling with rage. The saddle creaked as he loosened the cinch. He laid it on the ground, squatted beside it, and stared into its scars. $3, he muttered, voice low and bitter. $3 damn dollars, and I bought myself a death sentence. The next morning, Jed rode into the mining camp at Dry Creek. Men's eyes followed him as he tied Red to the rail outside the saloon. His boots thudded heavy on the boardwalk. He could feel the saddle pulling every look his way. Inside, smoke and heat wrapped him. Cards slapped on tables, whiskey sloshed in glasses, boots scraped on the floorboards. Jed pushed to the bar. "Whiskey," he told the barkeep. His voice was flat, but his eyes scanned the room. At the far table a man rose, tall, lean, with a scar splitting his cheek and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He wore a long coat too fine for this town, and he carried himself like a man used to taking what wasn't his. "Well, well," the man drawled, stepping close. "That's a fine rig you're riding, friend. Where'd a drifter like you get Jesse James's saddle?" Jed's hand drifted near his Colt. "Bought it." The man's grin widened, wolfish. "Then I reckon you bought yourself into a whole mess of trouble. Name's Cole Danner. Used to ride with Jesse. And that there," he jabbed a finger toward the door, where the saddle waited on Red's back, "don't belong to you." Jed held his stare, heat crawling up the back of his neck. Around the room the card game slowed, the laughter died. The whole saloon leaned in. Jed's hand twitched closer to the Colt. "Maybe it does now." Danner's smile vanished. His eyes went flat as a snake's. "Then you just declared yourself an enemy of every man still loyal to Jesse James." The silence cracked when a chair scraped across the floor. Jed didn't wait. He spun, shoved through the doors, and vaulted into the saddle. Red leapt forward, hooves hammering dirt. Shots barked behind him, splinters flying from the hitch rail. Jed rode hard for the open country, the saddle groaning under him, the outlaw's name burning like a brand beneath his legs. And as the bullet sang past his ears, one thought dug into his skull and wouldn't let go. He hadn't found Jesse James's saddle. The saddle had found him. Jed Calhoun rode until Red's chest heaved like a blacksmith's bellows, foam whitening the gelding's mouth. He didn't stop until the roar of the saloon behind him had faded into the lonely silence of the hills. Sage and mesquite blurred past in gray shadows, the moon cutting cold light over the land. When at last he reined up near an outcropping of red stone, Jed slid down, crouched, and laid his hand on the saddle horn. The leather was warm from the horse's sweat and his own weight. The tooling caught the moonlight, curled stars and vines faint under years of use. The name burned into the flap still seemed to whisper at him. Jesse James, the name alone could get him shot. Now Cole Danner, scar-cheeked, wolf-eyed, knew Jed carried it. Worse, Danner had claimed to ride it with Jesse once. If that was true, he wouldn't stop until the saddle was back in outlaw hands. Jed took the canteen from his belt and drank deep, eyes scanning the horizon. Somewhere out there in the night, men were mounting up. They'd follow his trail. He had a choice: ride farther into the emptiness and try to outlast them, or turn the saddle into something more than a curse. Jed wasn't much for running. By dawn he was back in Red Bluff, dust-caked and hollow-eyed. Folks paused when he rode past, their gazes fixed on the saddle. News traveled quicker than bullets. He could see it in their whispers, in the way hands slid under coats toward pistol butts. He didn't head for the saloon or the mercantile. He turned toward the sheriff's office. Ben Hollis was sheriff in name, though most men in Red Bluff reckoned he owed more to whiskey than to law. Still, he wore the tin star, and his office had a telegraph line. Jed swung down, tied red, and carried the saddle inside like it was a coffin. Sheriff Hollis looked up from his desk, bleary-eyed, hat pushed back. "Morning, Calhoun. What in blazes you totin' that rag for?" Jed dropped it on the desk with a heavy thud. He pulled back the flap to show the faint stamped letters. "Recognize the name?" Hollis squinted, blinked, then sat up straighter. "Jesus!" He licked his lips. "Where'd you get it?" "Bought it off the mercantile for $3. Didn't know what it was till I cleaned it." The sheriff whistled low, rubbing his jaw. "Son, you've gone and saddled yourself with more trouble than you can reckon. Jesse James's boys still scatter these hills. Some swear he ain't even dead. If Danner's laid eyes on this, half the gang'll ride straight for your throat." Jed's voice was flat. "They already tried." Hollis stared at him, then pushed back his chair. "Hell, give me an hour. I'll wire St. Louis. U.S. Marshals will want their hands on this." Jed shook his head. "By the time a marshal comes, I'll be bones in the dirt. Danner's moving fast. I need something now." The sheriff drummed his fingers on the desk. He glanced at the saddle, at the letters stamped in its hide. Then he leaned close. "There's a story." Whispered quiet. "That saddle ain't just a seat for riding. They say Jesse hid things in it, papers, markers, maps. Things the government would pay gold to see and his enemies would pay blood to bury." Jed felt the weight of the cartridge he'd found still tucked in the hollow seam. He didn't speak of it. Not yet. Hollis lowered his voice. "If you've got that saddle, you've got the key to every man Jesse James robbed, and every man he ever trusted." The office door creaked open before Jed could answer. Cole Danner stepped inside, hat low, a smile sharp as broken glass. Two men flanked him, rifles in hand. "Well, well," Danner drawled. "Didn't figure you'd bring it gift-wrapped to the law, Calhoun. Saves me the trouble of digging it out of your grave." Sheriff Hollis's hand hovered near his pistol, sweat shining on his brow. Jed's fingers curled, ready. The saddle sat between them, the outlaw's name carved into its skin, daring anyone to claim it. And Jed Calhoun realized this was no longer about what he'd bought for $3. It was about who would live long enough to ride with Jesse James's ghost. ChatGPT said. The office went still. Dust swirled in the slice of morning light through the door, hanging in the silence between men who all knew one twitch would spill blood across the floorboards. Cole Danner's smile didn't waver. He nodded toward the saddle sitting heavy on Hollis's desk. "Hand it over, Sheriff. That leather don't belong to you, don't belong to him." His chin jerked at Jed. "And sure as hell don't belong to the law. That's Jesse's. Always was, always will be." Sheriff Hollis's Adam's apple bobbed. His hand twitched near his pistol, but didn't lift it. "Cole, this here's evidence. Best I send a wire? Let the marshals—" The rifleman to Danner's right laughed low, mean. "Marshals can collect it off your corpse." Jed's jaw tightened. His palm hovered over his Colt, fingers itching. He spoke, voice flat as stone. "Funny thing about saddles, Danner. They don't ride themselves. You want it? You'll have to ride through me." Danner's grin sharpened. "Then let's see if you fit the seat better than the last fool who tried." The rifleman shifted, barrels rising. Hollis muttered a curse, fumbling for his gun. Jed didn't wait. He kicked the desk with his boot, sending the saddle crashing into Danner's chest. In the same breath, Jed's Colt cleared leather and barked once, the shot deafening in the tight room. The rifleman on the left spun and dropped, blood blooming dark across his shirt. The second fired wild, the ball splintering the doorframe inches from Jed's head. Hollis's pistol cracked next, smoke choking the air. Jed dove sideways, rolling behind the iron stove. Bullets punched holes through the wall, whistled past his ear. He came up on one knee, sights leveled. Danner's face snarled through the smoke, pistol raised. Jed squeezed the trigger. The outlaw's hat snapped off his head, the bullet grazing past his scalp. Danner cursed, ducking behind the door. His last rifleman fired again, but Hollis caught him in the gut. The man folded slow, wheezing, before toppling to the floorboards. Then it was quiet. Just the ringing of ears, the stink of powder, and the groan of a dying man on the floor. Jed kept his Colt leveled, breath ragged. He edged toward the door, eyes sharp. But Danner was gone. Boot prints in the dust outside showed he'd run fast, blood marking his trail. Jed cursed under his breath. Letting that snake live would cost them. Hollis leaned on the desk, pale and shaking. "Sweet Lord, Calhoun, you near got us killed." Jed holstered his Colt and lifted the saddle back onto the desk. His voice was low, steady. "No, Sheriff, this saddle near got me killed, and it's not done yet." Hollis stared at the name burned into the flap, sweat dripping down his temples. "What in hell are we supposed to do with it?" Jed looked at the saddle, at the faint letters that had turned his life upside down. Find out why Jesse James wanted it hidden, and why men are still willing to die to take it back. He ran a hand across the horn, feeling the weight of history and death pressed into the leather. Somewhere inside it, he knew, lay the secret. That cartridge had been just the beginning, and until Jed Calhoun uncovered the rest, Jesse James's ghost wasn't letting go. Jed lifted the saddle and slung it over his shoulder. The leather pressed hot into his back, heavy as a sack of iron. He stepped past the blood pooling under the outlaw's man, past Sheriff Hollis's wide eyes, and out into the sunlight. The town had gathered quick. Shots always pulled folks faster than church bells. Women pressed kerchiefs to their mouths. Children peeked from behind skirts. Men stood stiff with hands hovering near their belts. Every gaze fixed on Jed and the battered saddle on his back. He swung into red stirrups and settled into the outlaw's rig like he'd been born there. "Danner's running," he said loud enough for the street. "He'll be back with more. If any of you got sense, you'll be gone before sundown." No one moved. A silence thick as molasses held them. Jed tugged Red's reins and turned up the street. Boots scuffed behind him, Hollis stumbling out of the office, face drawn. "Calhoun," the sheriff called, voice cracking. "Where in hell are you going with that cursed thing?" Jed looked back over his shoulder to find out why Jesse James carved his name into it. His eyes swept the crowd. And why Cole Danner's ready to kill every man in this town to get it back. Then he spurred Red, and the gelding leapt forward, hooves sparking off stone, carrying them out past the last false-fronted building and into the hills. By the time twilight laid purple over the land, Jed had found a hollow among cottonwoods by a stream. He unsaddled Red, rubbed him down, then set the battered rig on a flat rock. He stared at it long and hard, the fire crackling at his side. The cartridge he'd found rattled faint in the hollow seam. He pulled it free again, rolled it between his fingers, studied the scratched words, "Liberty Bank, Clay County. The raid that had made Jesse James a legend and a monster. Men had died in the street that day. Farmers. A boy too young to shave. Some said Jesse regretted it until the end. Others claimed he laughed at the blood. Jed didn't know what to believe, but this cartridge said one thing clear. Jesse wanted the truth of that day remembered. Hidden in plain sight, carried in leather across 1,000 miles, waiting for the right man or the wrong one to find it. Jed set the cartridge down and ran his hands deeper along the saddle's seams. He found more rough stitching near the cantle. With his knife, he pried it loose. His breath caught when his fingers brushed paper. He pulled out a folded scrap, brittle with age. Ink crawled across it in a hurried scrawl. If this finds daylight, know that the men with me were not all willing. Some bled because they had no choice. Trust Cole Danner with nothing. He will sell us all to the highest hand. Jed's pulse hammered. Jesse James himself had written this, and he'd named Cole Danner a traitor over 30 years ago. The fire popped. Jed's head jerked up. Red lifted his ears. Scout, the stray dog that had trailed him from town since morning, growled low from the shadows. Jed shoved the paper back into the saddle's hollow and yanked his colt free. Branches snapped in the dark. Hoofbeats, voices. Danner hadn't run far after all. Jed kicked dirt over the fire, swung the saddle onto Red's back, and hauled himself up just as shadows spilled into the clearing. Rifles glinted. Danner's voice cut through the night, cold and certain. "Calhoun, you've got something belongs to Jesse, and I aim to take it off your corpse." Jed's lips pulled tight over his teeth. He dug his heels into Red's sides, the gelding surging forward into the black. Bullets hissed past, one tearing his sleeve, another whining off stone. Scout barked sharp and fierce, darting ahead like a ghost dog, leading the charge. Jed bent low over the horn, the outlaw's name under his legs, Jesse James's secret burning in his pocket. And behind him thundered the past, men with guns, with hate, with hunger for a dead man's legacy. Jed bent low, the wind clawing at his face as Red devoured the ground beneath them. The night exploded with gunfire behind him, rifles cracking, pistols spitting flame. Bullets tore through the cottonwoods, splintering bark, whining past his ears like angry hornets. He didn't look back. Looking back was for men who wanted to see death closing in. Scout bounded ahead, the dog's body little more than a blur of muscle and grit in the moonlight. Jed trusted the mutt's instincts more than his own. They cleared the gulch, scrambled up the shale ridge, and tore across the wide open flat beyond. But the riders were close. Jed could hear the clamor of hooves, the curses of men bent on blood. Cole Danner's voice rose above them all, shouting like a preacher promising hell. "Bring him down! That saddle's mine!" Jed pressed his boots tighter to Red's flanks. "Not tonight," he muttered. The gelding surged, sweat flying, lungs rattling like a forge bellows. They reached a cluster of rocks jutting from the flat. An old buffalo wallow hardened into stone. Jed pulled hard on the reins, wheeled Red into the shadows, and slid from the saddle. He yanked the rig free and shoved it behind the largest rock, covering it with his own coat. Then he crouched low, Colt steady, Scout pressed against his leg with a silent snarl. The riders thundered past, a dark wave of hats and rifles, missing the narrow cut where Jed hid. Danner led them, face pale in the moonlight, eyes wild. He pulled up 30 yards out, scanning the flat. His voice carried back, sharp and cruel. "Spread out. He ain't got wings. He's here somewhere." Jed's jaw tightened. He could drop Danner from here with one shot, end it clean, but a single flash from his Colt would draw the pack back on him, and he'd be torn to pieces before the smoke cleared. He waited, every muscle wired tight. The riders fanned out, searching. Minutes crawled. Finally, Danner cursed loud enough to shake the night. "He's riding hard. We'll track him come sunup. Saddle up." Hooves pounded again, fading slow into the distance. Dust hung in the moonlight long after they were gone. Jed let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He holstered the Colt, dragged the saddle back out, and sank onto the stone. His hands shook as he pressed them against the leather, against Jesse James's name. "Danner knows," he whispered. "He knows what's in you." The cartridge, the letter, proved Jesse had marked his own man a traitor. Danner wasn't just chasing history. He was chasing the one thing that could bury him in every saloon from here to St. Louis. Scout whined low, ears pricked to the empty horizon. Jed stroked the dog's head, then stood and heaved the saddle back onto Red. "All right, boy," he said, voice grim. "No more running. If Jesse James left a trail, we're riding it, and we're going to see where it ends." He swung up, turned Red east, and rode into the rising dawn. The sky bled gold, the hills stretched endless, and the ghost of an outlaw rode with him, etched in leather, carved in blood, whispering secrets men were willing to die to keep. And Jed Calhoun swore he'd drag those secrets into the light, no matter how many bullets it took. The dawn came harsh and red, spilling across the plains like blood poured over dust. Jed Calhoun rode with his hat brim low, the outlaw's saddle creaking beneath him, every mile carrying him deeper into a story that wasn't his, but had claimed him all the same. Scout loped beside Red's hooves, tongue out, ears swiveling like twin scouts of his own. By mid-morning, Jed reached the stage stop at Copper Bend, a single clapboard building squatted against the open land, with a water trough out front and a telegraph pole leaning like it was tired of holding the wire. The place was quiet, too quiet, but Jed needed water for Red and coffee for himself. He swung down, slow, eyes flicking to every shadow. The saddle's weight pressed on him heavier than his Colt ever had. He led Red to the trough, let him drink deep, then slung the saddle down and carried it inside like a man afraid of leaving his soul unattended. The keeper looked up from behind the counter, a thin man with spectacles sliding down his nose. His eyes, fixed on the saddle, widened, then narrowed quick. He forced a smile. "Mornin'. You ridin' far?" "Far enough," Jed said. "Need supplies. Beans, bacon, cartridges, if you've got 'em." The man nodded, fussing with jars on a shelf, but his hands shook. Jed's gut soured. He leaned on the counter, voice low. "You seen this saddle before?" The man froze. His lips parted, then shut. His eyes darted to the door. Jed's Colt was out before another breath passed. He laid the barrel flat against the counter, calm but steady. "Talk straight, friend. My patience don't stretch." The keeper swallowed hard. Couple weeks back, a man came through, tall, scar down his cheek. Left that saddle here, said he'd be back for it. Paid me to keep it hidden, but it spooked me. Too many stories tied to Jesse James. I figured I'd be rid of it if someone came asking. Didn't think it'd end up in your hands. Jed's jaw tightened. Cole Danner again. Always Danner. Always just ahead, just behind, circling like a wolf. "Where'd he ride?" Jed asked. "South," the man whispered. "Toward the breaks along the Brazos. Talk was he's gathering old riders, men who'd follow Jesse if he were still breathing." Jed slid the Colt back into its holster. He grabbed his supplies, dropped coins on the counter, and hefted the saddle to his shoulder. At the door he paused, voice like gravel. "If Danner comes back, you ain't seen me. You ain't seen this. You understand?" The keeper nodded fast, sweat shining on his brow. Jed stepped outside. Scout barked once, ears pricked. Dust rose on the southern horizon. Riders, too many. Jed cinched the saddle fast, swung into Red's stirrups and kicked hard. The gelding bolted into the open, Scout tearing at his side. Behind him, hoofbeats thundered. The sun glared hot in his eyes, the outlaw's saddle biting into his legs, Jesse James's secrets digging deeper into his soul. Jed didn't know if he was riding toward answers or his grave, but he knew one thing certain. Cole Danner wouldn't stop until the saddle, and Jed Calhoun's life, belonged to him. Jed pushed Red harder, the gelding's hooves pounding like war drums across the hard pan. The shouts of Danner's riders carried on the wind, harsh, eager, hungry for blood. Scout stayed tight at Red's side, weaving through brush and stone with the sure-footedness of something born to run. Jed risked a glance back. 6, maybe 7 riders. Dust trailed them like smoke from a burning house. Danner led the pack, his scarred face pale against the rising sun, his pistol flashing as he fired wild to spur the chase. "Damn you, Danner," Jed muttered, leaning low over the horn. "You won't have it." The outlaw's saddle groaned under him, leather biting his thighs, Jesse James's name stamped faint beneath his leg like a brand. Jed could feel the weight of the hidden cartridge, the folded note, the secrets buried in its seams. Secrets Danner wanted erased. Secrets men had already died for. The land opened wide ahead, a dry riverbed cutting across the plains. Jed yanked the reins, guiding Red down into the gulch. Dust sprayed as they skidded along the shale, rocks clattering under hooves. Behind, riders cursed as they scrambled to follow. Jed spurred hard, racing along the riverbed, the high walls hemming him in. He needed an out, fast. Scout barked sharp, darting left toward a narrow cut in the stone. Jed trusted the mutt and pulled Red into it. They burst out into a box canyon, walls steep and sheer. Dead end. Jed's gut clenched. He swung down, yanking the saddle free and dragging it behind a boulder. He crouched, Colt in hand. Scout pressed low beside him. Red snorted, stamping, sensing the trap. The riders poured in seconds later, their horses skidding to a halt. Dust swirled around them, rifles glinting in the sun. Danner sat tall, his grin sharp as broken glass. "End of the trail, Calhoun," he called, voice echoing off stone. "You run well, I'll grant you. Jesse would have liked that, but you've got something don't belong to you." Jed's voice rang hard across the canyon. "Funny thing, Danner, Jesse didn't trust you. He left his word stitched in this leather, and it names you traitor." The grin faltered. A flicker of rage darkened Danner's eyes. "Lies," he spat. "You think a ghost'll save you? That saddle's mine. Always was." He lifted his pistol, the other rifles leveled. Jed set his back to the stone, Colt steady, the outlaw's saddle hidden behind him. Scout growled low, teeth bared. "Then come take it," Jed said. The canyon went still, heat trembling in the air, the past and present colliding in the dust. And Jed Calhoun braced himself to kill or be killed, with Jesse James's ghost as his only witness. The first shot cracked like lightning, shattering the stillness. A slug ricocheted off stone inches from Jed's head, spitting chips into his cheek. He fired back, his Colt bucking in his hand. One of Danner's riders toppled from the saddle, screaming as he hit the dirt. The canyon erupted. Rifles barked. Pistols flared. Horses screamed and reared in the chaos. Jed rolled from cover, put 2 more shots into the dust at their feet, driving the riders sideways. Scout lunged, teeth flashing, clamping onto a boot and dragging a man down hard. Danner's voice cut through the storm. "Don't kill him! Bring him alive! The saddle's worth more than his hide!" Jed's teeth clenched. "Not if I can help it." He snapped off another shot, the slug tearing through a rider's shoulder, spinning him from his horse. The man tumbled into the dust, screaming curses that died to groans, but the odds were crushing. Bullets ripped the stone around Jed, powder smoke clouding the air. His Colt clicked empty. He ducked back, fumbling cartridges into the cylinder with shaking fingers. Danner dismounted, striding through the smoke like a devil loosed from hell. His scar twisted as he grinned. "Calhoun, hand it over, and I might just let you breathe another day." Jed's voice was ragged but steady. "You'll have to bury me to take it." He fired again, the shot whistling past Danner's ear. The outlaw snarled, raising his pistol. Then the ground shook. Hoofbeats thundered down the gulch. More riders, but not Danner's. The canyon mouth filled with a fresh wave of dust and noise. A voice rang out, sharp as a whip crack. "Drop your guns!" Men in long coats, badges glinting, poured in. U.S. Marshals, rifles leveled, faces set hard as stone. Danner spun, cursing, firing wild. One marshal's shot dropped the man beside him. Another slug tore through Danner's hat, sending it spinning into the dirt. "Fall back," Danner roared, scrambling onto his horse. What was left of his men wheeled with him, galloping for the canyon wall. Shots chased them, ringing off stone, but Danner and two others escaped into the dust. Silence crashed in behind them. Horses panted, men shouted orders, the canyon echoing with the stink of gunpowder and blood. Jed lowered his Colt, chest heaving. Scout growled low, teeth red but alive. Red stamped nervously, eyes rolling white. One of the marshals rode up, hat low, rifle steady. He looked down at Jed, then at the saddle lying scuffed and dusty behind the boulder. His eyes narrowed. "That it?" he asked. Jed wiped the grit from his cheek, voice rough. "Yeah, Jesse James's ghost, bound in leather, and near got me killed for $3. The marshal dismounted, boots crunching on gravel. He reached out, hand brushing the faint letters burned into the flap. His face tightened. "You best come with us, Calhoun," he said, "'cause whatever's stitched inside this saddle, the whole damn country's going to want a piece of it." Jed's breath came slow and heavy as the marshal's words sank in. The canyon was still thick with smoke, the tang of blood and burnt powder clinging to every breath. He holstered his Colt, his knuckles raw, his shirt torn by near misses. Scout sat pressed against his leg, chest heaving, eyes never leaving the saddle. The marshal lifted it in both hands, testing the weight. His jaw tightened. "Strange thing, Calhoun. Men don't bleed this hard for a scrap of leather. Jesse James left something in here, something worth more than gold." Jed wiped grit from his face. "I already found some of it. A cartridge, scratched with Liberty Bank, a note, Jesse's hand by the look of it, named Cole Danner, a traitor." The marshal's gaze snapped sharp. "Danner?" Jed nodded grimly. "He ain't just after history. He's after the one piece of paper could hang him twice over." The marshal looked to his men, gave a curt nod. They formed a ring around the saddle, eyes watchful. One leaned down, whispering harsh. The marshal grunted, then fixed his eyes back on Jed. "Danner'll come again, and harder. He'll bring every old rider still fool enough to follow his scar. You're tied to this now, Calhoun. Question is," his voice dropped, weight heavy in it, "you riding with the law or riding alone?" Jed's eyes drifted to the saddle, scarred and battered, Jesse James's ghost pressed into every seam. He thought of the fire at his shack, of men dying in the canyon dust, of Danner's voice promising death in the night. He spat into the dirt. "Don't much care for badges, but I ain't riding with traitors. You want Danner? I'll help you bury him." The marshal's eyes narrowed, weighing the words. Then he gave a slow nod. "So be it. Saddle up. We ride south at dawn. Danner's trail won't wait." Jed glanced at Scout, who thumped his tail once against the dirt as if he'd already chosen. Red pawed the ground, eager despite the smoke of battle still hanging thick. Jed swung into the outlaw's saddle again, the leather groaning like an old song. The marshals formed around him, the canyon swallowing the echoes of death as they rode out into the night. The stars wheeled above, cold and sharp. Somewhere in the dark hills, Cole Danner was gathering the last of Jesse James's riders, stoking them with promises of treasure and revenge. And Jed Calhoun, once a drifter with $3 to his name, now rode with Jesse James's ghost at his back, bound for a reckoning written in blood and leather. The marshals pushed south with the dawn, a hard line of riders cutting through the pale light. Dust curled from their horses' hooves, shadows stretching long behind them. Jed rode in their midst, Jesse James's saddle under him, the weight of history pressing heavier than the iron at his hip. Scout loped tirelessly alongside Red, tongue out, eyes sharp, as if he too knew the chase had only just begun. The marshal leading them was named Briggs, broad in the shoulders, gray at the temples, with eyes like chipped stone. He spoke little, but when he did, men listened. Now, as they crested a ridge, he raised a hand. The riders slowed, scanning the land below. Smoke, thin trails rising from the breaks along the Brazos. A camp. Briggs's jaw flexed. "Danner," he muttered. Jed narrowed his eyes. Shapes moved among the brush, men gathering, horses restless, rifles glinting in the early sun. Too many for a straight fight. Jed counted at least a dozen, maybe more. One of the deputies spat. "Outnumbered near 3-1. Briggs looked at Jed. "You rode closer to Danner than any of us. You know how he thinks. What'll he do when he learns what's hid in that saddle?" Jed's fingers brushed the leather at his thigh. "He won't stop, not till it's his, or burned to ash, so nobody else can touch it." He met Briggs's eyes. "He knows Jesse marked him traitor. That note in here, it's a death sentence in ink. He'll kill half the territory to bury it." Briggs studied him, then nodded once. "Then we don't let him choose the ground. We take him where he can't run." Jed leaned on the horn, thinking hard. His gaze drifted to the river, broad, shallow, full of jagged stone. "The Brazos cut. If we drive him there, he'll choke. Horses'll founder in the water. Rifles won't aim straight in the spray. That's where we break him." Briggs' thin smile showed. "You got the makings of a lawman, Calhoun." Jed shook his head. "No, just a man who's tired of running." The marshal lifted his hand. Orders passed low and fast. The riders fanned out, taking their places. Jed checked the Colt at his side, the Winchester slung across his back. He laid a hand on Scout's head. "Stay close, boy." Then they spurred down into the breaks. The camp erupted as soon as they hit it. Danner's men scrambled, cursing, grabbing for rifles. Horses screamed, dust boiling up as men leapt for cover. Jed fired from the saddle, the Colt's roar shattering the morning calm. A rider spun from his horse, blood spraying. "Calhoun!" Danner's voice ripped through the chaos, full of hate and fury. "You think you can wear Jesse's saddle and live? I'll cut you out of it myself." Jed wheeled Red, firing again, the outlaw's name under him like a brand. Scout tore into the fight, teeth flashing, dragging a gunman down by the arm. The Brazos roared nearby, its waters waiting. Jed drove Red straight toward it, Jesse James's ghost whispering in his ears, the saddle groaning beneath him as if it remembered every bullet it had already carried. And behind him thundered cold Danner, scarred face twisted in rage, hell-bent on reclaiming the past, or dying in its dust. Red plunged down the slope toward the Brazos, hooves tearing chunks from the bank. The river spread wide before them, water flashing cold and bright in the sun. Jed leaned low in the outlaw's saddle, teeth gritted, Colt hot in his hand. Scout bounded at Red's side, mud flying with every stride. Behind him came the thunder of hooves, Danner and his riders howling like wolves with blood in their throats. Shots cracked, slugs whining past Jed's ears. One tore a groove along Red's flank. The gelding screamed but kept running, muscles straining like steel cables. Jed spurred hard. They hit the river with a crash, spray flying high, current slapping cold against his boots. Red stumbled, righted, lunged forward again. Jed twisted in the saddle and fired back. One rider pitched sideways, lost in the churning froth. Danner's voice split the roar of water. "Don't let him cross! Bring him down!" The marshals swept in from the ridge, rifles leveled. Bullets sang across the water, smashing into Danner's pack. Two men went down screaming, horses rearing wild. But Danner himself pressed on, scarred face twisted with hate, pistol blazing. Jed drove Red deeper, water up to the gelding's belly now. Scout swam hard, ears flat, eyes burning. Another slug hissed past, close enough to tear Jed's sleeve. He raised his Colt, sighted, fired. Danner's hat snapped off, spinning into the current. The outlaw cursed, reined hard, then spurred forward, eyes locked on Jed with murder shining in them. The river boiled between them, spray blinding, current dragging hard. Red slipped, nearly went down, but Jed hauled him straight, the outlaw's saddle groaning like it remembered other desperate crossings. Then the bank loomed ahead, high, muddy, clawed by roots. Red lunged, scrambling up, hooves biting into the earth. Jed leaned low, dragging the reins, hauling the gelding free of the current. Scout clawed his way beside them, soaked and snarling. Jed twisted back. Danner was still in the river, eyes wild, horse flailing in the current. Behind him, his men broke, some swept downstream, others turning tail under the marshal's fire. But Danner kept coming. He rose in his stirrups, water streaming off him, pistol aimed steady. His voice was a snarl torn raw. "That saddle's mine, Calhoun. Jesse's blood rides with me, not you." Jed's jaw clenched. His colt came up, sight steady despite the pounding of his heart. "Jesse marked you traitor, Danner. The saddle says it plain, and I reckon it's time you answered for it." The two men faced each other across the fury of the Brazos. Guns leveled, ghosts watching. Jed squeezed the trigger. The colt bucked in Jed's hand. The shot split the air sharp as a whip crack. Danner's pistol wrenched sideways as the bullet smashed through his wrist. He roared, dropped the gun, and clutched at the wound, his horse screaming beneath him as it lost footing in the river's surge. The current took them. Jed watched as Danner tumbled, clawing at the reins, his scarred face twisted in pain and hate. His horse thrashed, slipped, and rolled. Water swallowed them both, dragging them downstream in a wild churn of foam and mud. The outlaws, who hadn't already broken, scattered like quail, chased hard by martial fire. The canyon rang with silence when the echoes faded, just the roar of the Brazos and the wheeze of Red's lungs. Jed holstered his colt with a slow breath. He ran a hand over Red's neck, feeling the tremor of the gelding's muscles, the sweat and river water mingling. Scout shook himself hard, flinging spray, then pressed against Jed's leg. Hackles still bristled, but eyes steady now. Marshal Briggs and his men thundered up the far bank, their rifles still hot. Briggs swung down, boots squelching in the mud. His gray eyes found Jed first, then the battered saddle still strapped under him. The marshal's jaw tightened. "It's over," Briggs said. "Danner's finished. Current like that don't let go." Jed wasn't so sure. Outlaws like Danner had a way of clawing out of hell when you least expected. But he nodded once. "Then it ends here." Briggs stepped closer, laying a hand on the saddle horn. His fingers brushed the faint carving, the outlaw's name burned into the flap. "You understand what you're sitting on, Calhoun? This ain't just leather. It's a ledger, a curse maybe. Every bullet Jesse James ever dodged, every life his gang ever took, men'll hunt it till the world ends." Jed's eyes went to the horizon, where the river cut away into miles of empty country. He thought of the cartridge with Liberty Bank scratched into its brass, the letter naming Danner traitor, the men who'd died just to touch it. "Maybe it ain't the saddle that's cursed," Jed said, voice low. "Maybe it's men chasing ghosts that should have stayed buried." Briggs studied him a moment, then gave a slow nod. "You done your part. You can hand it over now. Let the law carry Jesse's secrets." Jed's hand tightened on the horn. For a long breath he didn't move. Then he slid down from Red, uncinched the rig, and lifted it in both hands. The leather groaned like it remembered. He set it on the ground between them. Briggs crouched, unfastened the seam Jed had opened before, and pulled free the folded note. He read it quick, eyes narrowing, then tucked it in his coat. "This'll go to St. Louis. Danner's name'll rot in every court that matters." Jed exhaled, shoulders heavy, empty. He stroked Red's mane once, then looked down at Scout. The dog wagged his tail once, slow, as if asking, "What now?" Jed pulled his hat low. "Now we ride on. The saddle ain't mine, never was." Briggs straightened, the saddle under his arm, his men forming around him. Jed swung into Red's stirrups. The marshals turned north, bound for law and ledgers. Jed turned west, toward the sun dipping gold across the plains. He didn't look back. The outlaw's saddle had cost him blood, fire, and nearly his life. But it had given him something too, a choice. Jed Calhoun wasn't Jesse James, wasn't Cole Danner, wasn't a man chained to ghosts. He was a rider still breathing, and that was enough. Scout barked once, sharp against the wind, and together they rode into the fading light, leaving the saddle and its curse behind. The sun bled into the western sky, a molten coin sinking behind the mesas. Jed Calhoun let Red ease into a steady lope, the gelding's stride long and smooth, Scout padding faithfully alongside. The weight that had pressed on his shoulders for days, heavier than bullets, heavier than hunger, was gone. The outlaw's saddle no longer bound him, and yet Jesse James still rode with him, not in leather, not in carved letters or hidden scraps of ink, but in the lesson that every man who chased ghosts learned too late. The past will bury you if you cling to it. Jed had walked to the edge of that grave and turned away. The trail carried him into rolling hills streaked with purple shadow. Night birds cried from the cottonwoods, and coyotes yipped high and sharp in the distance. Jed tugged Red to a halt on a ridge and looked back. Far behind, faint and small, the glow of the marshal's campfire marked where Briggs and his men would ride north with the saddle come morning. Danner's name, Danner's sins, Jesse's secrets. They belonged to the law now. Jed tipped his hat low. Best they stay there. Scout pressed his shoulder against Jed's boot, tail thumping. The dog had chosen his trail without being asked, had bled and run through fire to stay with him. Jed bent down, scratching between his ears. "Reckon you saved my hide more than once, boy. Guess we're stuck with each other." Scout gave a soft bark as if to seal the bargain. Jed looked west again. A streak of dying light split the horizon, pointing toward a country that didn't care about Jesse James, Cole Danner, or cursed saddles. Towns that might not know his name, canyons that had never heard his gun. A place where a man could just be another rider passing through. He breathed deep, the scent of sage and dust filling his chest. For the first time in weeks, his ribs didn't feel tight with dread. He'd buried the ghost, and he'd lived to ride past it. Jed clicked his tongue, and Red started forward, hooves drumming soft against the hard pan. Scout loped easy at his sosid, tongue out, eyes bright. The night swallowed them, vast and silent, the stars stitching themselves across the sky. Behind him lay blood and leather, outlaw curses and near-death reckonings. Ahead lay the unknown. Jed Calhoun grinned, faint but real. $3, he said to the dark, almost laughing. Hell of a bargain. And with the dog at his side and the wide land opening before him, he rode on. No saddle but his own, no ghosts but the ones he chose to carry. The land stretched endless under the rising moon, silver light pouring across the plains. Jed Calhoun kept Red at a steady walk now, letting the gelding cool, his own bones easing after days of being hunted. Scout trotted ahead, weaving through brush, ears flicking back every so often to make sure Jed followed. The silence of the night pressed in, not empty, but alive. Crickets hummed, owls called low, coyotes yipped far off. For the first time since he'd laid eyes on Jesse James's name burned into old leather, Jed felt the world breathing again instead of choking him. He thought back to the shack, burned to ash, to the faces of Danner's men in the canyon, twisted in smoke and hate, to Danner himself, swallowed by the Brazos, scarred face roaring as the river dragged him under, dead maybe, but maybe not. Men like that had a way of clawing back out of the dark. Jed spat into the dust. If Danner lived, the saddle was no longer his to chase. Let Briggs and the marshals guard it. Haul it to St. Louis, argue over it in rooms with walls high and safe. Jed Calhoun's fight was done. Scout barked once, sharp, and darted up the ridge. Jed guided Red after him. At the top, the land unfolded wide and clean, rolling grass, distant buttes, the faint glow of lanterns from a settlement miles off, a place with beds, coffee, maybe even work. Jed lifted his hat, wiped sweat from his brow. "Reckon that's where we lay our heads tonight, boy." The dog wagged his tail, tongue lolling, and bounded ahead. Jed touched Red's neck, feeling the steady strength there. He'd lived through fire and lead, through the weight of Jesse James's ghost. All he had now was a horse, a dog, and the trail. But for a drifter like Jed Calhoun, that was enough. He urged Red forward. Together, the three of them, man, horse, and dog, rode down into the valley, leaving the outlaw's shadow behind them. The night swallowed their tracks, the stars wheeled overhead, and the wide country opened before them like a promise waiting to be kept. The trail bent west, carrying Jed toward the faint glow of lanterns on the horizon. The smell of wood smoke drifted faint in the night air, a sign of hearths and lives untouched by the curse of Jesse James's name. Jed Calhoun loosened his reins, letting Red pick the pace, his body finally easing out of the tight coil it had been locked in since the first shot was fired back in Red Bluff. Scout trotted ahead, his shadow stretching long across the moonlit dirt. Every so often the dog would glance back, eyes shining pale, as if to remind Jed he wasn't alone anymore. A coyote yipped in the distance. Jed's hand drifted near his Colt by habit, then fell away. He almost laughed at himself. After the riders, the river, the fire, what was one lone coyote? The land itself seemed to be telling him the truth. The worst was behind him. When he crested the last rise before the settlement, Jed pulled Red to a halt. Below lay a scatter of cabins and tents, lanterns glowing warm through chinked logs, smoke curling into the starry dark. A sign on a post read, "Copper Hollow, Pop 47. Jed tipped his hat, more to himself than to the town. Looks like home enough for tonight. He rode down slow, the sound of Red's hooves echoing against the quiet buildings. A few figures stepped out into doorways, drawn by the approach of a stranger. Jed raised a hand in easy greeting. "Evenin'," he said. His voice carried steady, calm. "Just a drifter looking for a meal, maybe a place to bed down." The tension in the doorways eased. One man pointed him toward a cabin with a lantern swinging by the door. "That'd be Miss Harper's boarding house. She feeds better than the saloon." Jed tipped his hat. "Much obliged." He swung down at the porch, tied Red, and gave Scout a pat as the dog settled by the steps. Inside, warmth wrapped him, the smell of stew, bread, and coffee. A sturdy woman with gray streaks in her hair looked him over without fuss. "Rooms are $1," she said. "Supper's on the stove. You pay honest, you're welcome." Jed set a silver coin on the counter. $1 for the room, another for the trouble. Miss Harper's eyebrows lifted, but she nodded approval. "Sit then. Eat." Jed filled a bowl, took bread in his hand, and for the first time in what felt like years, ate without looking over his shoulder. The stew was simple: beans, meat, onions, but it tasted like salvation. When his belly was warm and full, Jed leaned back, staring into the fire crackling on the hearth. The shadows danced over the walls, and for a moment he thought he saw the outline of a saddle there, faint and ghost-like. He shut his eyes, breathed deep, and let it fade. The outlaw's leather was gone, the curse was gone. All that remained was Jed Calhoun, alive and free under a wide sky. He finished his bread, rose slow, and headed upstairs to the room Miss Harper had readied. Scout padded after him, nails clicking soft on the floorboards. As Jed lay down on the narrow bed, hat tipped low over his eyes, he let the quiet of Copper Hollow settle into his bones. Tomorrow would bring new roads, new faces, maybe new trouble. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, he slept without ghosts. Morning light spilled across Copper Hollow, painting the cabins gold, smoke rising lazy from cook fires. Jed Calhoun stepped out of Miss Harper's boarding house, hat brim low, Red already saddled and waiting at the rail. Scout stretched with a yawn at the steps, tail wagging as if he already knew another trail lay ahead. Jed breathed deep. The air was clean here, untainted by gunpowder and blood. He could almost pretend he was just another drifter rolling through, not a man who'd carried Jesse James's ghost across the Brazos. But as he swung into the saddle, Miss Harper stepped onto the porch, arms folded. "Stranger," she called. "Word travels fast. Riders passed through before dawn, said they were looking for a man with a dog and a bay horse, said you were carrying something belonged to Jesse James." Jed's jaw tightened. Not anymore. Her eyes narrowed, sharp as a hawk's. "Doesn't matter. Outlaws don't care about truth, only what they believe. You'll bring fire on yourself, and anyone too close." Jed tipped his hat. "Then I best not linger." She studied him a beat longer, then gave a curt nod. "You ride careful." He touched his brim in thanks and nudged Red forward. Scout bounded ahead, eager for the open road. The trail west stretched endless. Mesas carved by wind, grass rolling like an ocean, sky so wide it made a man feel small. Jed rode steady, letting the miles roll under him. But Miss Harper's warning gnawed at him. If Danner hadn't drowned, if he'd clawed out of the Brazos mud, he'd still be hunting, and he'd bring others with him. Jed slowed Red at a stream crossing, letting the gelding drink. Scout lapped noisily, then froze, ears stiff. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Jed's hand dropped to his Colt. He scanned the tree line. Silence. Then, a glint of metal, quick as lightning, half hidden in the brush. He swung the Colt up just as the crack of a rifle split the air. Bark exploded from the tree behind him. Red reared, screaming, hooves flailing. Jed fired back, the shot ripping through the brush. A curse followed, ragged and mean. "Calhoun!" a voice bellowed, full of hate. Jed's blood went cold. He knew that voice. Scarred, furious, impossible to kill. Cole Danner, alive. Jed hauled Red around, Scout snapping at his heels. Shadows spilled from the trees. Half a dozen riders, rifles gleaming, faces twisted with hunger for blood. Danner rode at their head, scar pale, eyes burning like coals dredged from hell. "You thought the river would take me?" Danner roared. "Jesse's saddle is mine, Calhoun, and I'll cut you from it slow." Jed dug his heels into Red, the gelding lunging forward, hooves thundering. Scout barked sharp, fierce, as gunfire erupted behind them. The chase was on again, and Jed Calhoun knew the ghosts of Jesse James weren't finished with him yet. The trail twisted through broken country, gullies cutting sharp as knife wounds into the land. Jed Calhoun bent low over Red's neck, urging every ounce of speed from the gelding. Bullets snapped past his ears, one tearing through the brim of his hat. Scout bounded just ahead, dodging rocks, never faltering. Behind, Danner's men whooped and cursed, their rifles barking. The outlaw's scarred face burned with hate, his voice carrying over the chaos. "Calhoun, there ain't a hole deep enough to hide you." Jed's teeth clenched. His hand brushed the saddle horn. Jesse's name carved faint into the leather under him like a brand he couldn't shake. The cartridge and note were gone with Marshal Briggs, but Danner didn't know that. To Danner, the saddle was the only thing that could damn him, and so long as Jed sat in it, he was marked for death. The gulch narrowed, walls closing in. Red's hooves struck sparks off stone as he thundered through. Scout darted ahead, barked once, then veered sharply right. Jed trusted him. He yanked the reins, and Red lunged into a dry arroyo half hidden by mesquite. The riders thundered past, their shouts fading down the gulch. Jed slowed Red, heart pounding, listening. Silence but for the rasp of Red's breath and the tick of settling stones. Scout slunk back, tail low but eyes bright, as if to say, "Bought you a little time." Jed swung down, boots hitting the gravel soft. He pressed his back against the arroyo wall, breath steadying. Red blew hard, sides heaving. Jed stroked his neck, whispering low, "Easy, boy, easy." Above, a hawk wheeled, its cry sharp and lonely. Jed's eyes lifted to it. Danner would circle back. Wolves never gave up their prey. And Jed couldn't keep running, not forever. His fingers tightened on the saddle horn. If Jesse James had carried it through hell and back, maybe it carried more than ghosts. Maybe it carried a way to end this. Jed straightened, jaw set. He spoke quiet to himself, to Scout, to the ghost stamped into leather. "Next time Danner finds me, I ain't running. I'll finish it, one way or another." Scout growled low, tail bristling, as if he understood. Jed swung back into the saddle. Red pawed the earth, eager despite his weariness. They rode west, the sun sinking blood-red behind them, shadows long and sharp. And somewhere out there in the dying light, Cole Danner hunted still, scarred, furious, desperate to bury the truth Jesse James had left behind. Jed Calhoun rode straight toward him. The sun slid low, setting the horizon on fire. Jed Calhoun pushed west across open country, Red's stride long but steady, Scout pacing like a shadow that never tired. Each mile pressed quieter, lonelier, but Jed's gut told him Danner was never far. Outlaws like that didn't let go. They clung to hate the way burrs cling to a horse's tail, deep, stubborn, waiting their chance to draw blood. The land opened into a basin ringed with sandstone cliffs. Jed slowed, scanning the rim. Too quiet. No hawks, no coyotes. His hand drifted near his Colt. Then a stone clattered above. Jed jerked Red to a halt. Scout stiffened, hackles up, a growl rolling deep. Shadows moved along the cliff's edge. Men, rifles glinting in the fading sun. Danner's voice rang down, full of iron and hate. "Calhoun, you've run far enough." Jed wheeled Red, searching the basin wall for a way out. Sheer rock stared back at him, trapped. Danner rode into view at the rim, scar shining pale, eyes burning like coals. His horse shifted under him, eager for blood. Around him 6 riders fanned out, rifles steady, blocking every escape. "You sit in Jesse James's saddle," Danner called, his voice echoing off stone. "But you ain't worthy of it. That leather carried a legend. You're just a drifter, nothing more." Jed's voice carried back, calm but sharp. That saddle also carried Jesse's words, the ones that called you traitor. "You can kill me, Danner, but the truth'll bury you." The outlaw's face twisted, rage breaking through his grin. "Then I'll bury you deeper, where no one'll ever find you." He raised his arm, rifles leveled. Jed's heart pounded. He leaned down, whispered to Scout, "Now, boy." The dog bolted, barking fierce, darting toward the far wall. Every rifle swung to follow the sudden noise. In that blink, Jed spurred Red hard. The gelding lunged, hooves pounding, straight for a narrow cut at the basin's edge. Shots cracked, dust spraying, stone chipping around them. Jed fired back blind, Colt booming, keeping heads low. Red hit the cut like a battering ram, scrambling up loose shale, hooves clawing for grip. Jed leaned low, urging him on. Scout bounded beside them, fast as fire. Behind, Danner screamed, "After him!" Gunfire chased them, hot and wild. But Red clawed his way higher, lungs heaving, muscles straining until they burst over the rim and into open night. Jed didn't stop. He drove west, stars kindling above, the outlaw's voice still echoing in his ears. The chase wasn't over. Danner's hate was too deep, his hunger too sharp, and Jed Calhoun knew the next time they met, there'd be no more running. Only one man would ride away. Jed Calhoun rode through the night, stars wheeling overhead like cold lanterns strung across heaven. Red's breath steamed in the chill, his hooves drumming a steady rhythm that matched Jed's heartbeat. Scout ran close, tireless, every so often casting a glance back as if to remind Jed he was not alone in this fight. but Jed knew the truth. Cole Danner wasn't finished. The man's hate was carved deeper than his scar, and no river or canyon would swallow it whole. He'd come again with more rifles, more riders, and more fury. By dawn, Jed reached a ridge overlooking a valley split with cottonwoods and dotted with the smoke of cabins. A small town, too small to hide him for long, but big enough to water his horse, feed the dog, and maybe hear whispers of Danner's trail. He rode down slow. Folks lifted their heads as he passed, farmers at wells, women hanging wash, children chasing each other in the dust. All eyes lingered on the saddle. Even battered and worn, it carried a presence, a weight that drew gazes like moths to a flame. Jed tied Red at the hitch rail outside a weathered saloon. Scout settled in the shade, tail flicking. Inside, the place smelled of whiskey and smoke, a piano jangling out of tune in the corner. Conversation dimmed when Jed stepped through the batwings. He kept his hat low, moved to the bar. "Coffee," he told the barkeep. His voice was quiet, but it carried. The barkeep poured, eyes flicking to the door where Jesse James's saddle waited on Red's back. He leaned in low. "Stranger, you don't know the kind of fire you're haulin'. Men'll kill just to touch that leather." Jed sipped, the bitter bite steadying his nerves. "Men already tried." A voice spoke behind him, slow and oily. "And more will." Jed turned. 3 men stood by the door, dust on their coats, iron heavy at their sides. Not Danner, but his kind. Hard eyes, hands that twitched too close to guns. One of them sneered. "Danner's comin'. He wants his saddle. You keep riding with it, you won't see another sunrise." Jed set his cup down, rose easy. "You want it," he said, voice flat. "Try and take it." The room held its breath. The piano stilled. Boots creaked as men shifted clear of the line of fire. The outlaw's hand twitched. Jed's Colt cleared leather in a blur, the barrel flashing once, twice. Thunder rolled in the saloon. When the smoke cleared, 2 men lay sprawled, Boots kicking their last. The third froze, eyes wide, pistol half drawn. Jed's gaze locked on him, steady as a coffin lid closing. "Go back to Danner. Tell him I ain't running anymore. Tell him I'll be waiting." The man swallowed hard, dropped his gun, and bolted through the doors. Jed holstered his Colt, finished his coffee, and stepped back into the morning sun. Scout rose, ears pricked, ready. Red stamped the dust, eager. Jed set a boot in the stirrup, swung into Jesse James's saddle, and turned west. The time for running was over. The next meeting with Cole Danner would be the last.